In the quiet Venezuelan town where she was born, Paula Salazar spent her early years surrounded by laughter, the warm embrace of family, and a future that seemed as boundless as the sky. She was a spirited child with dark curls framing her face, and an unshakable curiosity for the world around her. Family photos captured her wide-eyed innocence, and the mischief that only a child her age could carry, moments that her father, Leonardo, held close to his heart. For him, Paula was a beacon of light, a daughter he cherished deeply, someone he could only imagine thriving. Yet, in an unthinkable twist, the same world that seemed to hold infinite promise for Paula would soon become the stage for a horror that not only shocked her family, but transfixed 2 countries. 3 years later, in Ecuador, the unthinkable happened. One evening, Paula was rushed to the hospital. According to her mother, Andreina Bermudos, Paula had suddenly lost consciousness, a turn for the worse caused by respiratory complications. At the hospital, her stepfather, Washington Aymara, backed up Andreina's story, claiming that Paula had suffered a tragic accident. But as doctors examined Paula's body, their hands froze, eyes widening at the bruises spreading across her small arms and legs, the broken ribs, and the fractures they found in her spine. Each injury spoke of something more insidious than a simple fall. Suspicion crept into the minds of the medical team. How could a young child, supposedly under the loving care of her mother and stepfather, end up so violently bruised, broken, and scarred? In that hospital room, the pathologists and doctors took their notes, a quiet storm brewing in the backdrop as they wrestled with their questions. The records would later list the cause of death as respiratory failure. But beneath that simple line, whispers of something far darker started to swirl. Paula's injuries didn't add up with the peaceful image of the quiet girl in her father's photographs. Her story, now emerging in fragments, felt chillingly familiar, echoing the dark tales of systemic failures that had surfaced in cases before her. The stark image of her broken body, paired with the official clinical cause of death, sent shivers through everyone who read her report. Before her death, Paula's life in Ecuador had taken an ominous turn. Her father, Leonardo, wasn't there to protect her. He had entrusted her to Andreina, hoping that the move would be a fresh start for both mother and child. But her mother's new partner, Washington Aymara, had come into the picture, a man with a clouded past, whose interactions with Paula raised questions among their neighbors. After the move, it became clear that the once safe world Paula had known was shifting, and not in her favor. Gone were the carefree afternoons. In their place were long hours indoors and subtle but undeniable signs of change that worried those who glimpsed her through the haze of Andreina's ever-tightening control. But no one could have anticipated how far things would go. For Paula, what seemed like a new chapter with her mother was becoming a nightmare, one marked by escalating violence and, as it would turn out, devastating consequences. Her father had once imagined her growing up strong and free. Now, as the details of her death slowly unraveled, he faced the horrifying possibility that he might have entrusted her to people who meant her harm. With the investigation underway, 2 nations followed the mystery of Paula's untimely death, haunted by what the truth might reveal. Paula Salazar's father, Leonardo, was the kind of parent who wore his heart on his sleeve when it came to his only daughter. From the start, he was captivated by her bright energy, her sense of curiosity, and her resilient spirit. Their bond was unshakable. In their quiet Venezuelan town, he was her world, and she was his. Leonardo lived for those moments, her laughter filling their home, her questions about everything under the sun, and the unbreakable trust they shared. Even when things changed, and Andreina, her mother, gained custody and moved Paula to Ecuador, he held onto the belief that Paula would be safe in her mother's care. Despite their separation, Leonardo maintained a father's faith that Andreina would protect Paula. A faith that would later haunt him as the truth of her final days unraveled. Andreina Bermudos was more than just Paula's mother. She was a woman of contrasts. Well-educated and articulate, she presented herself as a responsible and caring mother. In social settings, she spoke with a confidence that exuded knowledge and poise. But for those who knew her closely, Andreina's sharp edges were hard to ignore. Friends and family members had noticed an intensity in her that bordered on unsettling. Beneath her polished exterior lay a complex personality. While she managed to uphold the appearance of a loving mother, there were moments when her words and actions suggested a darker, manipulative side. She was known for her ability to control situations and for an almost uncanny knack for evading difficult questions. This duality, a caring facade masking a potentially dangerous core, made her a critical figure in the events that would come to light following Paula's death. As details surfaced, many began to question whether Andreina's image of a devoted mother was genuine or a carefully constructed front. Washington Aymara, Andreina's new partner, brought his own complexities to Paula's life. With a background shrouded in ambiguity, Aymara's arrival into family was met with quiet concern by those who sensed something unsettling in him. Aymara had a temper that simmered beneath the surface, and though he kept a low profile, whispers of his volatile tendencies reached the ears of a few close to the family. There was something about his presence that created a sense of unease, a silent warning that things might not be as they seemed. Aymara's interactions with Paula were noted to be distant at best, and those close enough to observe saw his attitude toward her as indifferent, if not outright cold. Andreina and Aymara formed a troubling pair, each bringing their own shadows to Paula's life. As her primary guardians, they held immense influence over her daily reality, a power that became dangerously apparent in the weeks leading up to her tragic death. While the extent of their role in Paula's suffering was initially unclear, the subtle tension between their public personas and private behavior planted seeds of doubt. With both of them in charge, what should have been Paula's safe haven instead became the place where her nightmares unfolded. Paula's teachers were among the first to notice that something was amiss. At school, the lively and curious girl they had once known began to change. They noticed bruises on her arms and legs, and Paula's once bright eyes had grown guarded, her once vibrant energy subdued. Concerned, her teachers took note of these changes and attempted to reach out, only to be met with vague explanations that never seemed to fit the severity of her injuries. One teacher recalled an incident when Paula, normally cheerful in class, appeared unusually withdrawn, wincing every time she moved. When asked, Paula would offer hesitant explanations, brushing off the injuries as minor accidents. However, as weeks passed, her excuses seemed to wear thin. They began recording her visible injuries in school logs and attempted to contact Andreina, but her response was dismissive and curt, brushing off the concerns as unnecessary meddling. The teacher's alarm grew as they noticed behavioral changes in Paula too. She was no longer her inquisitive self, often staring blankly or recoiling at sudden movements. During one lesson, Paula confided to a trusted teacher about persistent aches in her back and legs, only to quickly change the topic, as though afraid of saying too much. Concerned, the school reported these findings to local social services, hoping that professional intervention might provide the help Paula clearly needed. In notes recorded in school files, one teacher described her frustration. "I am worried about Paula's safety. She appears frightened and is visibly injured." Yet her explanations never matched the severity of what we're seeing. Yet despite these repeated reports, social services failed to act. The system intended to protect children like Paula seemed, in this case, reluctant or even indifferent. Each report filed by the school landed on desks and in inboxes, where it was reviewed, only to be marked as insufficient evidence for intervention. The explanation, if one was even given, pointed to the family's apparent stability or lack of concrete proof. To Paula's teachers, this refusal to investigate felt like a betrayal, as if the system itself was turning a blind eye. For them, it was a bitter pill to swallow, a clear failure of the protocols meant to shield children from harm. But what might have seemed like negligence to the outside world was even more devastating for Paula. She continued attending school with fresh bruises and increasingly distressed behavior, each appearance a silent cry for help. Had social services looked deeper, the horror unfolding behind closed doors might have come to light. However, each missed opportunity to intervene amplified the danger she faced, allowing her suffering to go unnoticed by those in the best position to help. A small glimmer of hope arose when a health worker visiting the school noticed Paula limping. Concerned, they arranged for her to receive a physical examination, but despite a doctor's note suggesting potential abuse, the case was still dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Paula's situation then remained hidden beneath a layer of bureaucracy and unanswered questions, a chilling realization that highlighted the system's cracks. Even the school's efforts to provide Paula a safe space were stifled by the looming authority her mother held. Paula often came in with complaints about pain, which she attributed to minor mishaps, but her teachers sensed there was more to her story. In hushed tones, they discussed their mounting suspicions, feeling helpless as they watched the bright girl they had once known slip further into silence and fear. They were desperate to help but found themselves bound by limitations they couldn't overcome alone. As these signs of trouble went ignored, Paula's story grew darker, hinting at an unfolding tragedy that no one seemed able or willing to prevent. March 27, 2020 started as any other day in the household where Paula lived with her mother and stepfather, Washington Aymara. However, by evening, everything had taken a tragic turn. According to Aymara's account, Paula had gone to the bathroom alone and, after a few minutes, seemed to have accidentally drowned. He insisted that she must have slipped and hit her head, falling into the water. This story seemed implausible, but to the responding medical team, it was also deeply unsettling. They could see that Paula's injuries went far beyond what could be expected from a simple slip in the bathroom. The story Aymara recounted felt flimsy in light of Paula's actual condition. Her tiny body was covered in bruises, and as the hospital staff examined her, they noted multiple signs of trauma. Her ribs were fractured, there were noticeable bruises around her torso, and her spine showed signs of extreme stress, as though she had been subjected to considerable force. The doctors knew that these injuries could not have come from a single fall, especially in such a small space as a bathroom. They immediately began to question the story Aymara had given them, and their suspicions were communicated to the authorities. The findings were enough to set off a chain reaction. While Paula's mother, Andreina, maintained a sense of shock detachment, Aymara's behavior appeared evasive and nervous. When questioned by police, he repeated his story, but gave inconsistent details, adding to the suspicion surrounding him. The police moved quickly to detain him, seeing in him a potential danger and the primary suspect in Paula's death. The arrest happened swiftly, casting a shadow of doubt and tension over the household and the story Aymara had tried to present. With Aymara in custody, the investigation into Paula's death had only just begun, and as more details emerged, it became clear that the horror surrounding her death was far from over. When the investigation into Paula's death began, Andreina's initial reaction was to defend her partner and, shockingly, to deflect blame toward Paula herself. In her first statements to authorities, she claimed that Paula was prone to self-harm, suggesting that her injuries might have been the result of her own actions. Andreina mentioned that Paula had experienced respiratory issues that worsened due to COVID-19 complications, conveniently explaining away both her injuries and her sudden death. This narrative, however, felt more like a deflection than a genuine attempt to uncover the truth. For those who knew the family closely, Andreina's story was hard to believe. Friends and extended family began coming forward with stories that painted a very different picture. A few shared instances of overhearing unsettling arguments and noticing Paula's bruises, which they claimed Andreina would dismiss or explain away as minor accidents. These friends recalled Paula complaining of pain in her back or limping on certain days. But each time concerns were raised, Andreina had a ready answer, describing Paula as clumsy or blaming her for what she called attention-seeking behavior. These testimonies cast a new light on Andreina's role in Paula's life, hinting that she may have been more involved in Paula's suffering than she let on. As more people learned of Paula's tragic death, outrage began to spread on social media. Leonardo, Paula's father, spearheaded a campaign to bring attention to his daughter's case, posting heart-wrenching photos of her bruises and the medical reports detailing her injuries. Supporters shared Paula's story widely, calling for justice and demanding accountability from both Andreina and Washington Aymara. The campaign, hashtagged Justice for Paula, quickly gained traction, attracting hundreds of followers who posted and reposted information to keep the story in the public eye. As the pressure mounted, Andreina's story began to shift. Initially, Andreina had claimed that Paula's injuries were self-inflicted, but as public scrutiny grew, she began offering new explanations, ranging from mysterious health issues to claims that Paula had a rare genetic condition that made her prone to fractures. Each new version of events further fueled the public's suspicions and cast doubt on her credibility. Friends close to Andreina noted that her explanations seemed increasingly desperate, each one only adding to the growing mystery surrounding her involvement in Paula's life. The conflicting stories and mounting public pressure ensured that Paula's case remained in the spotlight, demanding a truth that still lay hidden. When Leonardo Salazar received the call that his daughter Paula had passed away, his world shattered. News of her death reached him 3 days after it had happened, delivered by a distant family member rather than by Andreina herself. The initial shock quickly turned to a sickening sense of disbelief. As he processed the news, the details given to him that Paula had died of natural causes didn't sit right. "How could my Paula be gone? She was so full of life," he later recounted to friends. To hear that she had suffered from respiratory complications seemed unimaginable, knowing she had never had such issues before. The distance between him and his daughter in those final days was a burden he would carry forever, each unanswered question intensifying his grief and suspicions. In the days following Paula's death, Leonardo's heartbreak deepened as people close to Andreina began to reach out with disturbing information. Some former friends of hers, disturbed by the news, approached Leonardo with stories they had kept hidden, fearing retaliation. They recounted moments when Paula showed up with fresh bruises, stories Andreina brushed off as accidents or self-inflicted injuries. They shared photographs and text messages documenting Paula's deteriorating condition, pieces of a puzzle that painted a horrifying picture of a little girl suffering in silence. Each new detail was like a fresh wound to Leonardo, who realized that he had been left in the dark about the truth of his daughter's life in Ecuador. It was not just grief he felt, but a deep, seething rage at the betrayal of trust and the unanswered cries for help that had gone ignored. Determined that Paula's story would not go unnoticed, Leonardo took to social media, launching the Justice for Paula campaign. His posts began with tributes to his daughter, photos of her smiling, moments of joy that stood in stark contrast to the images shared by Andreina's former friends. He posted hospital records and medical findings showing evidence of the broken bones and extensive bruises that Paula had endured. The campaign quickly gained traction, shared by people across both Ecuador and Venezuela, who were horrified by the brutality Paula had suffered. The hashtag Justice for Paula became a rallying cry for justice. And as more people learned of Paula's story, the public outcry grew. Support poured in from strangers, activists, and advocates for child protection reform, who spread the word far and wide. Leonardo had lost his daughter, but his determination to honor her memory sparked a movement that demanded accountability and change. As the investigation gained momentum, a second autopsy was ordered to verify the cause of Paula's death and to uncover any additional evidence of abuse. This autopsy report revealed a horrifying reality. Paula's body bore signs of chronic repeated abuse. Her ribs had been fractured at different stages, showing evidence of injuries that had healed only to be broken again. The spine and shoulder injuries were consistent with prolonged physical trauma. Doctors noted old bruising patterns that suggested systematic harm, signs that Paula's suffering had been neither recent nor isolated. The extent of her injuries told a story of unimaginable pain, a stark confirmation that her death had been the tragic culmination of prolonged violence. The case took a chilling turn when new evidence emerged, suggesting that Andreina might have been complicit in her daughter's suffering. Text messages between Andreina and Aymara were leaked to investigators, some of which referenced Paula's behavior in an unsettling tone, blaming the young girl for acting out and expressing frustration about her presence. The language and tone hinted at a dark side to Andreina's relationship with her daughter. Further, statements from Andreina's friends who had come forward indicated that she had occasionally confided in them about her difficulties with Paula, hinting that discipline in their household might have gone far beyond standard parental guidance. This revelation added a layer of complexity, leading authorities to question Andreina's role not just as a mother, but as a potential enabler, if not an active participant, in the abuse. The deeper investigation revealed disturbing gaps within Ecuador's child protective services system, highlighting systemic failures that had allowed Paula's abuse to continue unchecked. Despite multiple reports from Paula's school and community, social services had deemed the evidence inconclusive and had not followed up adequately. There were missed calls, unreturned emails, and dismissive responses that showed a lack of urgency. Social services had effectively closed Paula's case on more than one occasion, citing insufficient grounds for intervention, even as evidence of her suffering mounted. These failures left a chilling question. Could Paula's death have been prevented if the system designed to protect her had intervened sooner? This layer of systemic neglect added an additional heartbreak to Paula's story, one that left the public demanding accountability for every agency and individual who had failed her. As Paula's story spread across social media, the outrage became a collective cry for justice. People drew parallels between Paula's tragic end and other high-profile cases of child abuse, such as the heartbreaking case of Gabriel Fernandez, a young boy in California whose death revealed deep flaws in the child protection system. Comparisons were drawn, and the public began demanding reforms, hoping to prevent more tragedies. Hashtags like Justice for Paula and Protect Our Children flooded social media, with users from Ecuador, Venezuela, and beyond voicing their support for change. The case highlighted a disturbing pattern of systemic neglect that resonated with people worldwide. And the momentum only grew as each new revelation came to light. In the initial court hearings, the legal complexities of Paula's case quickly surfaced. Andreina and Washington Aymara's legal defense teams argued vehemently, attempting to divert blame away from themselves. They cited Paula's alleged health issues, the initial autopsy results, and her supposed behavioral problems, trying to muddy the waters and obscure the abuse that had been inflicted on her. But Leonardo, unwavering in his pursuit of justice, was there for every hearing, often speaking directly to the press to highlight the horrific treatment his daughter had endured. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence, he faced significant legal obstacles. Local child protective services and social services, too, were called into question, with advocates filing complaints and petitions to hold them accountable for their negligence. These agencies, which had previously ignored signs of abuse, now found themselves under scrutiny as the public demanded answers and justice. Driven by grief and determination, Leonardo's campaign continued, gaining support from child welfare advocates, activists, and citizens who refused to let Paula's story fade. His efforts expanded beyond the courtroom and social media as he teamed up with local and international organizations to demand changes in how child welfare cases were handled. Protests were organized outside the courthouse, and activists distributed informational pamphlets on child abuse prevention and the need for systemic reforms. The community that had come together online began taking tangible steps to ensure that Paula's legacy would be one of protection, accountability, and change. As the movement continued to grow, calls for legal reform gained traction. Petitions circulated, gathering signatures to push for more rigorous oversight of child protective services, mandatory abuse reporting by teachers and healthcare workers, and stricter penalties for child abuse. This push for policy change resonated with lawmakers who acknowledged the necessity for comprehensive reform. Paula's tragic story had exposed glaring holes in the child protection system, and her legacy inspired a movement committed to ensuring that no other child would suffer as she had. This groundswell of support transformed her death from a private tragedy into a rallying point for sweeping societal change. For Leonardo, the fight for Paula's justice is a battle that will never truly end. Each memory of her, every smile frozen in time in family photos, is a reminder of the life she should have had. The pain of losing her is compounded by the knowledge that her suffering might have been prevented if the warning signs had not gone ignored. Reflecting on her final days, he finds himself haunted by the idea that his daughter was left defenseless, vulnerable to the very people who should have protected her. His grief is a constant, lingering presence, a testament to his love for Paula, and a driver behind his commitment to ensuring her death was not in vain. Paula deserved so much more than this, he has often stated, his voice heavy with sorrow and determination. His mission now is to make sure her story is a catalyst for change, so that no other child endures a similar fate. In honoring Paula's memory, Leonardo calls on all who have followed her story to take action. He invites people to join the Justice for Paula movement, urging them to speak out against abuse and support child protection reforms. Petitions calling for stricter monitoring of social services and mandatory reporting from educators and healthcare professionals have already gathered thousands of signatures, and continued support is vital to turning this tragedy into lasting change. By participating in awareness campaigns, signing petitions, and advocating for policy reforms, supporters can help build a safer future for vulnerable children. Through collective action, Leonardo hopes that Paula's story will inspire communities everywhere to stand against abuse and prioritize child welfare. Paula may be gone, but her legacy remains a rallying cry for justice, compassion, and reform.